Christopher Miller is an American journalist covering foreign affairs, national security, global conflicts, crises, and politics with a special focus on Ukraine, where he's lived and worked since 2010. He is the author of the book The War Came to Us: Life and Death in Ukraine, published by Bloomsbury in July 2023. Christopher Miller is also the Ukraine correspondent for the Financial Times. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to find more of the fantastic guests and experts that we feature. And do check out the list of Ukrainian charities that we have in the description of the video. All of them are extremely popular and verified by Ukrainians, but also do consider becoming a patron or buy me a coffee if you like the work of the channel and would like to support what we do. Christopher, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you.
Well, I've been looking forward to this because I had a sort of cursory talk with Ada Wordsworth where we reviewed the best books of the year. Your book is very, very firmly on that. So let's dive into that. Can you tell me a little bit about the genesis of the book? Because you've been in Ukraine a lot longer than many people who are putting books out at the moment.
Yeah, I've been wanting to write a book about Ukraine for, I guess, the better part of a decade now. And I think it first started, while covering the beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine back in 2014. And at that time, I was running around the Donbass in Ukraine's east with several of my journalist colleagues, many of whom were in Ukraine either for the first time or had reported from Ukraine off and on over the years, but were based in London or based in Moscow or someplace in the Middle East, covering other conflicts. And all of them, I could sense from them, and some explicitly said so. There was this sort of sense of envy or a little jealousy that I had spent so much time in Ukraine prior to that. So at that point in July of 2014, I'd already been in Ukraine for 4 years and lived in the Donbass for the first 2 of those 4 years. So I knew the region very well. I had a lot of contacts out there, and I was getting really great stories and really great I had fantastic contacts. I was able to report from both sides of the war at that time. And I think, I benefited from that past experience and those contacts there. And, what a couple of my friends, in particular, Tom Parfit, who works at the Times and just wrote an excellent book himself, High Caucasus, and my friend Mark McKinnon from the Globe and Mail, who wrote this prescient book called The New Cold War more than a decade ago, we're saying, look, you're in this unique place to write a book about life before and during wartime. You should really think about putting something together. But of course, at the time, the war was incredibly fast moving. The editorial demands that I was facing didn't really give me that time. I was also transitioning from being a freelancer to becoming a staff correspondent. And I just simply didn't have the time to really put something together that resembled a pitch, let alone several chapters of a book. But it was always in the back of my mind, right, that I, as a person who lived in Ukraine for already many years at that point and had these unique experiences, I could serve as a strong narrator of these really key events that were shaping the country. And so, fast forward to, I think, late 2015 or mid 2015, and in 2016, when the war, after a couple of terrible Minsk agreements, had sort of settled into a simmer rather than a hot war, I did find some time to sit down and jot down some ideas and even a couple of sample chapters. And so what I began writing was essentially what would become the first 3 chapters of the first section of The War Came to Us. And it was about my life pre-war in the city of Artyomovsk, which now has been returned to its historical name, Bakhmut. About the experiences that I had there, the people that I met, what it was like politically, socially at the time. These were very rough, chapters. I really was just trying to get everything down on paper. Fortunately, I am the type of not only journalist, but person who saves just about everything. I'm not a pack rat, not physical things, but in terms of conversations, emails, I document everything. I file them away and make them easy to bring back up. And so I had a daily journal that I had kept while serving in the Peace Corps in Bakhmut, that I relied heavily on for conversations, timelines. I had an active blog that I kept. It was password protected. It wasn't public at the time, but it was for anyone who, close family members or friends who wanted to follow my journey as a Peace Corps volunteer during the 2 years that I was doing that. And I had archived all of that. So the situations that you read in the first chapters of the book, and some people have asked me, how do you remember something that happened so long ago, especially when so much has happened since? Well, for me, it was really easy. I just looked back at my journal, my emails that I sent to my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, my family, friends, my blog, all of that. Everything was there and had been preserved. And so it was easy to recall those memories and even the dialogue, because I actually would write that out. In a few cases, I would call up my old friends and ask them, what had happened. And so that's when I got the first start on this. But then, I sort of shifted tacks for a little bit. I started covering the migration crisis in Europe and events in Israel back then, even, and then always being based in Ukraine. And basically, I just became kind of distracted, and I set it aside, and I didn't feel as though it was quite the right time. A lot of the world's attention was not on Ukraine, after 2014. And so I thought, okay, at some point when I have the time and the energy to do it, I'll come back. I also didn't think at the time I really had the voice that I wanted to write this book in, as fine-tuned as I wanted it to be. And so, I just, again, I set it aside. I went about my work, which I was very happy with, and didn't return to it until January of 2022, as Russia was gearing up for its war and Ukraine was being talked about again. But unfortunately, in the context of will Russia invade or not, Bloomsbury reached out to me and said, look, everybody's talking about Ukraine. We're interested in a book about Ukraine, and we've asked a lot of people who we should approach about writing that book. And everyone has mentioned you. So what is it about you? What's your story that you have to tell? How do you see this? And, I said, I'm happy to talk about this. I've got an idea, but I'm not very flexible on that idea. It's got to be, what I want to do, and it's got to be done this way, or, I'll gladly recommend you some other people you could approach if you have something else in mind. And, fortunately, I think for both of us, the idea that I had fit very well with what they wanted, which was a book that was not academic in nature, not a exhaustive, comprehensive history book, of which there are many and many good ones. They wanted a narrative. They wanted a book with a voice, with strong Ukrainian characters, that was more than just what was happening in the moment, but provided some context for it. And I said, I think I have that. And I think my experience of being in, living in Ukraine and reporting on Ukraine for more than a decade is what you're looking for, especially these, the extent to which I covered the war at its beginning in 2014. And I'm on the ground right now. So whatever is happening, that is going to be written about in this book. So we verbally agreed on a book. I drew up basically an abstract over a weekend, and then sent these 2 or 3 very rough sample chapters that I had written back in 2015 and 2016. And they loved it, and they said, let's do this. And I said, great, my agent will get back to you in a few weeks' time. Of course, February 24th comes around, Russia invades. I'm busy reporting out in the field on all of this, and I still did not sign my contract. I sort of set that aside, and to me that was not the least important thing happening. So I think it took until late March or even early April of 2022 when I finally signed the contract, and then got to working more actively on this book.
Because until that point, and if we recall back to those days, some people were saying, no, Ukraine is going to survive, but actually many um, believed, either due to propaganda or just not knowing Ukraine enough, or dare I say, not knowing Russia enough as well. They thought, Kiev would be overrun in 10 days or whatever it was. That seemed to be quite a common belief, not just in the deluded planning departments in Moscow, but also amongst many sort of Western planners and politicians as well. From your perspective on the ground, did you at any point in those early months have this fear that you would have to flee along with many tens of millions of Ukrainians, or did you have a firm belief from your experience that actually Ukraine would be resilient enough to push Russia back and as we see what happened, put up a very stiff resistance?
Well, there was no doubt in my mind that Ukrainians would resist. I had witnessed what happened on the Maidan when Yanukovych's security forces attacked a group of mostly children, and the huge public response to that, which was tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians to come out to the streets and protest, and of course, that transformed into the revolution. And even as people were dying, more protesters were spilling into the streets. Right, the response in 2014 when Russia invaded was, the Ukrainian military at the time was caught flat-footed, right? There were only 5,000 to 6,000 troops with combat experience. That was certainly not enough to respond to what Russia was doing. And some of them even changed sides down in Crimea. So the response then was civil society volunteers, the protesters on the Maidan becoming soldiers overnight and stopping Russia's advance in Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, and in Kharkiv as well. And so just seeing the Ukrainian response to Russian aggression over the years left no doubt in my mind that Ukrainians would respond, that they would do whatever it took to defend their country, to defend the capital, Kiev. I think, the question in my mind was, would it be enough? And I think that was the big question. And like you said, many in the West did not believe it would be. Russia's army being the quote unquote second greatest in the world, certainly by size and I think materiel, absolutely. It is a powerful army with a much deeper bench and larger stocks than what Ukraine has. I didn't have any doubt in my mind, Ukrainians' resilience or determination, having witnessed those events in the past. But I was certainly there was an amount of concern on my part. Would Kiev be overrun? Would this resiliency, this determination, the threat of Ukrainians' existence be enough to stop this massive advancing army? Obviously, we know the answer to that now. It would be, and with very little assistance in those early days from the West. Outside of hundreds of NLAWs and Javelin anti-tank missile systems, which did a lot of good and provided were crucial to that defense. Ukrainians largely did it on their own, and that didn't surprise me. I thought that was just absolutely incredible. It really did set the tone for that first year of war, I think, and or of all-out war. And I think that's what, even now, 2 years later almost, I think still gives me hope that, I have no doubt in my mind that Ukrainians will continue to fight, whether our countries and governments provide support or not. Right? I mean, with our support, they're going to have a better chance at succeeding and defeating Russia's army. Without our help, they're still going to fight. It's just that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Ukrainians at some point may end up dying. People will continue to die, but at a greater rate without our help. But Ukrainians will not stop fighting.
And this, of course, gives the lie to a conversation which is coming up more and more. We're seeing it in the context of the US election upcoming, and that is this, for those who understand it, it's a fairly deluded position, and this is the idea that negotiations are possible with Russia, that some kind of parity or fairness is possible, or even that Russia can be depended on to actually follow through with any pieces of paper it signs up to. But we are seeing in the media and amongst some quarters and in within various electoral debates, this, I would say, idea, this slightly deluded idea of negotiations being a possibility to end the war, at least this year. What is the Ukrainian position on that?
Well, put it as simply as possible. Any negotiations that were to happen right now would be beneficial to Russia, because Russia is still occupying almost 20% of Ukrainian territory. So to negotiate anything that would see these territories remain occupied, or Ukraine capitulate to Russia and accept them is, as Russian territory. I mean, that's totally unacceptable to a majority of Ukrainians, right? And so negotiating a peace right now, the Ukrainians will tell you, and I would agree with this, that it would freeze the line, the line of contact or the front line, and solidify Russia's grip on these territories. It would allow Russia time to regroup and then re-invade again, which is essentially what happened with the Minsk agreements in 2014 and 2015. Both allowed time for the Russian military, and at that time as well, there's separatist proxies in Donetsk and Lugansk, to reconstitute and launch fresh attacks, right? This would only embolden Russia and say that what it has managed to do so far has essentially been accepted, and so that's why there just can't be any kind of negotiation at this stage. But also, to negotiate, you need two partners, or not partners. You need two sides who are willing to come to the table, and whether that's a literal table or a figurative table, and agree to discuss and negotiate a deal. And the Ukrainians aren't prepared to do that right now, because they know what Russia has perpetrated against their country and their people. We've seen what they've done with to Mariupol, to Bucha, to many, dozens of other cities and towns across the country. They've lost too much to settle for a deal that would not be beneficial to them and would only continue to threaten their very existence, and the country's existence, right? And Russia is not willing at the moment, and Vladimir Putin is not willing to come to the table and negotiate a deal. He has said, as recently as his press conference in December, we have not achieved our goals. Those goals being the demilitarization of Ukraine, the quote unquote denazification of Ukraine, and the takeover of, at the very least, all of Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, the Donbass, as well as much of the south, right? I think Russia has been very clear that it also would like to take Kharkiv. It would like to take Mykolaiv and Odessa, right? To create this land bridge, not only that connects it to Crimea, but sweeps all the way across the south, even connecting to Moldova and the breakaway area of Transnistria. The goal also was, even though it was less explicit in those early days when Putin launched this invasion, calling it a special military operation, to see Kiev's capitulation and the capture of Kiev. And so, that remains, we have to understand that remains a goal of Putin's. So, Ukraine's goal of expelling Russia from its territory has not been achieved. A majority of Ukrainians, polls show, and anecdotally, I can tell you that's also how people feel and what they say when we talk about this. That's what they want to happen. They want Russian soldiers to be out of their territory and their territory to be restored back to its 1991 post-Soviet borders. And the Russians want to, see Kiev's capitulation. So we're looking at two sides that are nowhere near the place that they would need to be to conduct any kind of negotiations. So I think that kind of talk of we need to stop this war for peace and save lives doesn't really make sense, because the key negotiators here are not ready to negotiate, and actually freezing this conflict now, coming to any kind of agreement to stop the fighting, really would ultimately likely lead to the death of more lives in the future, because it's not going to be a solution. It's just going to be a pause. And after that pause, what's going to happen? Well, history shows us that Russia will again go on the attack to try to achieve the goals that it originally had set out to achieve.
And peace, like this sort of narrative stalemate, which unfortunately, in quarters of the media that are perhaps less versed in local context, perhaps have less resource and time to sort of think about what they're writing about, this narrative of stalemate is trotted out as if it, and it covers a hugely complex situation. Similarly with peace, it creates the illusion that peace is this sort of wonderful state of non-war that should be aspired to. But if Russia dominates Donbass, it would be surely peace without justice. I mean, keen to hear what you think, because in the first case, no one would be prosecuted for the crimes that took place in those areas. Secondly, Russia would work very hard to erase all evidence of those crimes and anybody who can attest to those crimes. Thirdly, hundreds of thousands of kidnapped Ukrainians, including children, would never be returned, and justice would not be achieved. So peace without justice, could you sort of talk to that, and why sometimes some media narratives are so simplistic as to cover up really what is a very complex and sometimes, appalling situation with these kind of simple concepts?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought those up. This is, you're exactly right. I mean, any kind of negotiations or settlement at this moment, that wouldn't include holding Russian forces accountable for the many atrocities they've committed, would of course be a failure, a massive failure. And that's what Ukrainians want, as much as the war to stop is accountability and justice for the many lives lost here. And that's unlikely to be included in any negotiation that would happen right now. So I think it can be difficult to write about that, because, as you mentioned, this is an extremely complex, complicated issue. I think when it comes to international law, war crimes, it takes a lot of work to report this out, to understand these things, and it's just not a simple narrative. And I think in this day and age, when we have fewer and fewer journalists, fewer and fewer foreign correspondents, editors, readers have attention spans that are growing shorter and shorter. Our article lengths are getting shorter in many cases. It's just not enough space, and we don't have enough time to report all of that out and explain, I think, why that is important. That's not to say that some don't. We do, and I think we at the Financial Times have done a good job of that. Also on our opinion pages and editorial pages, the FT has taken a really strong, pro-Ukrainian stance, and I think spoken about the importance of justice. Other major international papers have done so as well. But I think it's fair to say there's probably not enough coverage that explains why the matter of justice is crucial to any negotiation, any peace settlement that will happen in this war. And certainly it's one of the most important aspects that Ukrainians speak of. It's not enough to just end the war. Even on in the best case scenario, where Ukrainians are able to expel Russian forces beyond the 1991 borders and they've restored their territorial integrity, they will demand, and they're right to do so, justice for the atrocities committed here. I just think, yeah, you're right. It's an extremely complex issue. We're seeing that now with Israel and South Africa's case that they've lodged in the criminal court, and the United States response to that. I think Anthony Blinken, this week, I forget the word that he used, but essentially speaking out against this. Right? It's a complex, nuanced matter that takes some time to understand before properly explaining it. And so perhaps that's why it's not spoken about enough. I also think that a lot of the people who are pushing these negotiate now narratives are, at least in my country, far right-wing Republicans who, in the past, I would say, if not pro-Russian, have shown sympathies, or sympathy for the Russian side. And they are the ones that have pushed this narrative of, well, NATO was creeping into Russia's back door. They have every right to defend themselves. These types of pro-Russian narratives that the Kremlin has used to justify its aggression against Ukraine. And so they are, I feel, less likely to speak about the issue of justice, because when you speak about justice, in the context of the war here in Ukraine, it really means accountability for Russia's actions. What Ukraine has done is defend its country from an invading aggressor. What Russia has done is attempt to commit, or arguably in some cases commit, genocide against a country to destroy the post-World War II order, to completely rearrange our international security and European security and reshape that. They're not going to look at Russia as the aggressor. And so I think that's another reason why that justice issue isn't a part of the argument for by this group of people in particular who are pushing this message.
And of course, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Russia clearly backing the South African motion. South Africa, in some instances, has been seen to act almost as a proxy for Russian interests on certain topics. And this is sort of how we get into the hybrid warfare, isn't it? Because essentially there are issues to address. There is potentially, the Foreign Secretary Cameron hinted at that just a couple of weeks ago, that there may be issues of international law to address, which Israel, in its response, potentially heavy-handed. I think it's too controversial to necessarily say that without going into it in more detail. But of course, the South African lawsuit is omitting as much evidence as it is covering. Now, this is in Russia's interests, because what they seek is not justice. They seek division. They seek conflict. They seek to confuse and distort arguments so that people, disengage, or even extremes become weaponized and angry and turn on each other. You've seen this kind of hybrid warfare in action. And some of these narratives still work, unfortunately, in the Donbass, in Crimea, little green men, and the multi-layered approach to this hybrid, both informational and physical warfare, plausible deniability. How do you, what from your experience has taught you about the mechanics of this kind of Russian military operations?
Yeah, I do think a lot about that, because in 2014, when I think we got our first real up close look at this type of hybrid warfare of Russian disinformation, it was confusing. It was it was not easily understood at first. I think we were slow to accept what it was. I think we asked in the media a lot of the right questions, but I think we were slow to respond to it, to explain it, to understand it. And I think that there were, some people, Ukrainians in particular, who understood it better, having dealt with it, but maybe not, didn't have a sexy name for it, Russian disinformation or hybrid warfare, years before that, who, were shouting from the hilltops, and, we, the media or the West, sort of saying, well, we'll decide what it is. And uh, it was, yeah, I mean, just an extremely confusing moment. I think since then we have come to learn much more about it, to understand it, to recognize it. I think especially after our 2016 election in the United States, this became much more of a topic, although a rather polarizing one in the United States. I think now, in the context of the current Russian invasion, it's much better understood. I would argue that I think we understand it better. I think it is less insidious now, because we recognize the signs, we know what to look for. I do think that there are people who ignore those for personal political reasons, and like you said, there are some people. You were using the case of South Africa. In this lawsuit, I think some people. Well, I'll back up. I guess it's seeing it in action here was interesting for me. Being on the ground, for example, in eastern Ukraine in 2014, being completely gaslit by some of the Russian soldiers or commanders, or their appointed figureheads in the East, when they're saying one thing to me, and I'm looking at, they're saying, for example, that Russian soldiers are not here. This is a fight for our independence, and I'm looking at his bodyguard, and it's very clearly a Russian soldier. I mean, it was completely disorienting, and it really was actually difficult in that moment to report this. You would just have to say, they're saying this, but I'm seeing this. And in some cases, I remember editors at various places saying, well, I'm not sure that's enough to say it's a Russian invasion. And there were a lot of these arguments being had in newsrooms about what we call what was happening, right? And who these people are who are fighting. Are they pro-separatist or pro-separatist rebels? Are they Russian soldiers? Like, what do we call this? And I think Russian disinformation was effective then because there was no agreement on what was happening, who these people were, how we should describe it. Whereas today, I think, this is a very explicit Russian invasion, right? Vladimir Putin said, despite what he called it, a special military operation, this is a war. Russian soldiers are involved. Then there was this denial, and at least in the media, we have to be held to certain standards, and there are ethical standards and moral considerations, but there are also legal standards, and that actually, I think, is where Russia has been smart about how it's played this disinformation and its hybrid warfare, using facets of our own democracy and the fundamentals of our democracies against us, essentially weaponizing them and turning them around, was effective in those early days. I think we've gotten a lot better at dealing with it now, but obviously, it still exists. I think we're going to see whatever the sort of new iteration of Russian disinformation and hybrid warfare is this year, especially with our elections in the United States coming up in November, some other key elections in the European Union. So I'm interested in seeing, how it rears its head now, and whether or not that's going to be effective, and if we've learned lessons from the past.
And it's multi-layered, isn't it? I think that's where there are real problems with this, because the hybrid warfare isn't just about having soldiers on the ground and so on. It's also influenced through oligarchs. So it runs through multiple layers. It could be oligarchs, it could be sort of so-called sort of factories or industries where they have some kind of influence, or they could put coercion. It's mafia networks. It's a multi-pronged kind of thing. And I think whereas some historians are starting to uncover that, it's very difficult, isn't it, for the news media to pick apart what is a multi-layered kind of strategy there, both from information, but also activating various influence networks. And then, of course, you probably have GRU agents behind the scenes orchestrating things, but you wouldn't necessarily have any information as a journalist about their.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think that with the speed at which these types of narratives are created and are spread online is much faster than we in the media oftentimes can churn out a story. And so these narratives have already taken hold by the time media workers, journalists are reporting out the story, and that narrative has already taken hold in many situations, and it can be difficult to dispel when it's several days or weeks after it's already out there on social media and been established, and then here we come in late to the conversation and are trying to pick it apart, and who at that point wants to read something like that, right? I think it's this type of disinformation works very well in our current information environment.
And another tricky area is, of course, distinguishing between organic political protest and influenced or orchestrated political protest. And I think that's one of the other major challenges in Ukraine. And in fact, it's really come up even this year in critiques of Zelensky, the government, Ministry of Defense, various things, the corruption scandals and processes to prosecute corruption. It's very difficult to tell, isn't it, where organic politics ends, which is entirely justifiable and actually necessary, and where the weaponization of it comes in. I mean, I've been saying for a long time that Arestovich is clearly on the weaponization side, and I see him as a Russian asset. I know not everyone agrees with that, but there are others like Oncharenko and others who are clearly engaged in organic politics, the cut and thrust of that, which is valid. But this is an area where Russia really has us over a barrel, isn't it? Because it's so difficult to pick those two different strands apart.
Well, yeah, but I would argue that Ukrainians see that very clearly. I think they understand it really well, and I think they've known who Arestovich has been and his game, what it has been for a while now. I actually think it's, I mean, and perhaps for someone like myself who's been entrenched in Ukraine for more than a decade now, and has seen all kinds of political manipulations and tricks played out here. I think I have a pretty good grasp on that situation, and I know when somebody is actually politicking organically, and when it's the types of manipulations and games being played by someone like Arestovich. But I think generally speaking, Western observers of Ukraine struggle to figure out when that actual organic politicking stops and when it is manipulation and game playing. Most, if you asked a majority of people in the West who Arestovich is, they probably wouldn't even know what you're talking about, right? What is an Arestovich? They would probably say. And so I think when they pick up on something, let's say on the platform formerly known as Twitter, this chatter about Arestovich and some of the, let's say some of the, they find, let's say some of the narratives that are being pushed by bad actors to be, I don't know, of interest to them, and they find that maybe Zelensky's, maybe they side with the argument that Arestovich was pushed out, and he's just a truth seeker and speaker. Why is the government of Ukraine and Zelensky's office persecuting him? And they might be more apt to side with an argument like that, not understanding the nuances and the local politics here, like Ukrainians do. Ukrainians, they cut right through that bullshit, and they know exactly what's going on. They know who he is. They can recognize disinformation and organic politics versus inorganic politics and this sort of manipulation. They see this, they recognize it. We don't, because I think we're not steeped in it. We're steeped in it in our own way, but not in this, in the context of the Ukraine war, I think. And so what can happen, what I've seen happen, is that Westerners sort of place their own beliefs and politics onto this Ukrainian canvas, and it's not a perfect overlay, right? It's a very different shape and thing, and it doesn't fit, but they believe that it does. And so they want to believe the I don't know, the Tucker Carlsons or whoever it is that is using these manipulations for their own political purposes, because the way someone like him would shape that sounds reasonable, right? Well, isn't this persecution? Well, no, here's the context, but that's that requires another level of understanding and and digging into the topic. And again, that comes back to, I think, our attention spans, our personal politics, and but I think, to go back to where I began, I think the Ukrainians actually are really good at picking this out, and it's we probably should all be listening more to them when it comes to these matters, and hopefully we in the media are elevating their voices enough when we write stories about this issue, for readers to pick them out and be able to take their word for it, rather than, let's say, the byline on the article, or one of us shouting to the high heavens on social media, please do not believe this narrative. Arestovich is not someone who should be used as a source without being properly contextualized.
Ukrainians have also developed various techniques and methodologies to counter Russian disinformation and efforts of media literacy. Some of them incredibly successful, which I think we should emulate. And that's one of the reasons why I created this channel. Is I felt that, one, Ukraine has something unique to teach us, but also we need to get ourselves immunized as far as possible, or develop some kind of immunity to this sort of disinformation. In the last part of the conversation, I'd like to focus back on the book and, of course, your reporting. And, the reason why this struggle against disinformation is relatively successful in Ukraine is because it's existential. It's a matter of life and death. It's not just a sort of lifestyle choice. And we don't have that same sense yet of it being existential to our existence or values, although perhaps we ought to. For you and your writing, both in the book and your articles in the Financial Times, the fact that this is a fight for survival of Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian land, language, way of life, all these kind of things, does that add a sort of energy and impetus to your writing, a kind of urgency to that? And how does it affect the book? Because when you write about places like Bakhmut, these no longer exist. You're writing about something or recreating something which has been utterly despoiled and violated by Russia.
I think this is probably the most important thing that I've ever done in my life, in terms of my work, reporting on this war, which I think is I would argue one of the most important issues of certainly this early century, if not the past many decades, right? I think it has the ability to completely reshape the world and Europe as we know it. This is a war of conquest. I do think the Ukrainians have a very strong argument that this is a genocidal war. I've seen, what has been targeted, and why it has been targeted, and it seems clear to me that Russia wants to wipe Ukraine and Ukrainians off the map. I think that's incredibly important to shine a light on and to not forget and to not take the light off of. With the book, I really wanted to paint a broad picture of, how we got to this point, but also to show the complexities. I don't think, while Russia's invasion and Ukraine's defense, I think, are black and white, and I would argue that there is probably the most good versus evil kind of element to this war. Well, I would say, there's in any more than any war in the past, or since the Second World War, I would argue, there is an element of good versus evil here, right? Russia being the evil, Ukraine being the good. This was a completely unprovoked war. Russia was not going, it posed no threat. Ukraine posed no threat to Russia. I really wanted that to come through in the book, but also to underscore the complexities, many of which are really fascinating and not negative at all, in the book, because there has been this very complicated history between, of Russia and Ukraine existing side by side or coexisting, and what Russia has done to Ukraine over the years, the decades, the centuries, and I think that comes through the characters and the stories, and just, the broader narrative, seeing how things have evolved or devolved from 2014 and the revolution through today. My experience as someone who lived in Bakhmut for 2 years, and it was my adopted home. I feel very close to the place. I'm still close with many of the friends who I met there and in contact with them regularly. I see them here in Kiev or elsewhere where they've been displaced. For me, that also is a really important aspect of this, right? I'm in the position where I can explain to people in this book and in my reporting that this is a place that existed peacefully with tens of thousands of residents. And I think showing how it went from that, a place with, events in the city center and, this place where life existed, to a place that was almost razed completely to the ground, is a sort of microcosm of what Russia is doing and its greater war. And that's why I focused so much in the first part of the book on pre-war Bakhmut, because I think it's not enough for people to just see the result of a Russian bombing campaign, because you have to understand what it was before, to have that, the sort of like that weight, of it being completely destroyed resonate with you, right? Seeing images, I think we're desensitized to like images of buildings destroyed and crying civilians and people being dragged on stretchers to hospitals. We see them from wars and conflicts across the world, and what is impactful for me personally is the sort of before and after, understanding what it was like before this horrific thing and that change. And so I kept that in mind. I was conscious about that in writing the book, really trying to show the before and after, and underscoring those points that I made before, which is that the war came here, right? Ukrainians were not looking for this. They were perfectly fine with before Russia's military intervention here. Again, I think it's it's crucial that we in the West keep an eye on this. Not only that, continue to support Ukraine, because to come back to where we sort of began, the Ukrainians are going to continue fighting. regardless of whether we assist them in that fight. It's just that the more we assist them, the better chance they're going to have at winning here, and the fewer lives are going to be lost. You know, the less we help, the worse it's going to be for them, and the more lives are going to be lost. And I think that also comes with, you know, greater consequences beyond Ukraine.
That's a very important place to end there. A very important message, especially in the context of the US elections and actually many other election processes coming up over the next couple of months through 2024. Thank you so much for speaking to me, Christopher. I really recommend people check out your book. As you say, it has a unique take and it has a kind of depth to it. That's not to say the other books aren't great as well, but this has an extraordinary depth and experience to it, which I think people will benefit from understanding and immersing themselves in. Thank you so much for speaking to me and our audience today.
It was great to chat with you. Thank you for having me on.